welcome back. I'm glad to call up Rita Smith for our introduction of guests.
Good afternoon, everyone. Guests, when I call your name, please stand so I could give you a warm Kiwanis welcome. Our first guest is Likey Phillips, guest of Sue Sweat. Thank you. Kelly French, guest of Carol Whitmore. Armani Carrot, guest of Julia Showers. James Teller, guest of Henry Lawrence. And Omar Edwards, guest of Ray Bellamy. Thank you all for attending today and welcome.
Thanks so much, Rita. I'd like to call up Christy Healy for our community service update.
Good morning. First of all, who's in Leadership Manatee or is a graduate of Leadership Manatee from here? Raise your hands. All right, Color Wars this coming Wednesday. Be sure and be there. Team Green. Woohoo! All right, sorry, back on to community service. Excuse me. We only need one more volunteer for both of the events on September 25th and 26th for the Performing Arts Center right here. So thank you who have already volunteered. Coming up, we have a lot of things in the near future. Sharon's also working on getting us 3 more dates with the Performing Arts Center. We're really trying to support where we do business here. Also, October 31st, who has kids who do not trick or treat at your house, where you just kind of turn off the lights? Okay, so you can come to the Manatee County Fairgrounds. Kiwanis will be hosting a table and handing out candy. A great way for you still to see all the great kids and give back. Those are the first coming up things. We have a lot more on the calendar. Please watch Member Day, and we'll be putting a flyer in Mac's newsletter for more information. I'll stop there, because that gets us through October. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Very excited about our speakers today. I happen to know Miss Peggy, and we got to go to Germany earlier this year on a mission trip together. So very excited to hear for both her and Ron talk about their book, Miguel's Bay, the story of a family and pioneering through early Florida. So with that, Peggy, come on up. Yes, ma'am.
Well, it's good to be here. We need to thank Gilbert Smith for inviting us. He found us at the public market where we sell our book from October to May and bought one. And now he's our best friend because he told me he's read it twice. So thank you for this invitation. This is our favorite kind of group to speak to because you're our people. You're Bradenton, Manatee County, you're history people. And this book was not meant to be a history book, but it turned out to be one. I'm 5 generations from here. I go back to Miguel, Joseph, Gabriel, Guerrero. He was a young fisherman from Menorca, Spain, and he immigrated here in 1845. And guess where he settled? He found the most beautiful little island called Teresilla, and fishing up and down the Gulf Coast, he found the bay first. He could scoot in away from the storms. He could get his boats in there, and they were secluded to be safe. And Teresilla was the island for him. Miguel Bay, of course, it's called Miguel Bay now, but back in the day, they would have said, that's Miguel's Bay, because there weren't many people here. So when one person lived on one half of an island, that kind of became his island. And, later in 1842, with the Armed Occupation Act, settlers could actually apply for land and get the deed. They had to stay on it for 5 years, build a homestead, and prove that they had a business. And then they would be given a deed to that spot after 5 years. And they had to protect it in case there was a war, which Miguel didn't know was coming, was the Seminole War and the Civil War. But so he eventually owned the land. Unfortunately, he died before he got the deed, but it was passed on to his two sons. One became Robert Fogarty and one became Edmund Miguel Lee. So you'll see how that happened when you read the book. I'm not going to tell you all the answers right now. Before we start, I'd like to appreciate you all by giving away 2 books. So I was going to ask, who's the oldest Kiwani in here today? If you want to admit it. Now, women, you don't have to tell. Okay, who's 79? Who's 80 and above? Who's 90 and above? So are you the only one? 80 and above? Come get a book. Oh. Give it to somebody else? Okay. We found out when we started selling the book that a lot of people didn't recognize the landmarks that were written in the book. So we put together a driving tour with all the addresses and a little description of all the places. So when you read the book and you give us your email address, we can send this 5-page PDF to you. And yours has that. I went ahead and printed one out for you to have. So you can drive around for 4 hours and see all the places. Now, the old houses and the old buildings may not be there, but you can see at least where they were. We had a Civil War salt works place in Manatee County, and even some of the Civil War buffs don't ever realize that that was here. It was on Portosueno Road in Palmasola, and when you go there now, you're going to see a big mound of grass, and you're going to say, I learned in McGill's Bay that that's where the salt works was. You do? Well, you're going to see it today. Yeah. So who's the youngest Kiwani in here? 20s? Someone in their 20s? Someone in their teenage years? Okay, of the two 20s, who's the youngest? Okay, Miss 24. I wanted to give it to the oldest and to the youngest because a lot of our young people now don't really have a sense of much old history of Manatee County. And the old people will remember a lot of things by reading the book because it'll bring back some memories, especially if you grew up here. I have a mother who's 92 and still in good health, and she remembers it. She was class of 1950 in Manatee High School. So she's a walking history book. And a lot of the reason this book exists is because of my mother. I moved back to Bradenton about 8 years ago after being in the Atlanta area, after college and marriage and raising 3 sons. And my mom had been a legal secretary. She had 4 file cabinets chocked full of deeds, marriage licenses, pictures, newspaper articles. She was on the Manatee County Historical Society for years, volunteered at the park. She loved her history, and so did her brothers and sisters. And now that every time an aunt or uncle dies, the cousins bring all their stuff to me, because Mom kind of passed the torch on to me to be that historian. She gave me 4 huge file cabinets. I have boxes everywhere in my house, and I can't get rid of anything till she's gone. She won't let me throw one paper away, and sometimes she'll say, can you find that paper about so-and-so, and I'll go dig for 3 hours trying to find something. But she loves her history, and she's so glad that this book got written because it seriously was something she thought she would have time to do one day. And after she retired and helped with grandkids, my dad had macular degeneration and went blind, and so she really had to spend a lot of time with him his last 10 years of life and didn't get to write the book about Miguel and Frederica Kramer. And the reason she felt like it should be written is because there are books that tell the story of Miguel, but they don't get everything right and they don't give a complete story. And because they're family, we had all this family history that we could share about the family and about Manatee County back in the 1800s. Miguel actually came in 1845. Like I said, I think he came on a schooner, not even a steamer, from Minorca, found Terracea and got started. So we start with the first hurricane that ever hit Florida, 1848, back before hurricanes even had names. And it's documented, and that's the first chapter. So you start off with a bang, welcome to Terracea, It's a hurricane, and he survived it and still decided he would stay. You know, you have to realize back then there were no highways, no roads, no bridges. If you didn't have a boat, you probably couldn't come to Florida and settle there. So a lot of people would go to New Orleans or New York. They would go around the tip of Florida or come down from New Orleans in a little boat with their few possessions, maybe an axe and a shovel. And imagine pulling up to Mangrove Island, Terracea, with a shovel and an axe and saying, I'm going to carve away an acre to build a little cabin. Can you imagine? And then there's the bugs. Then there's the temperature. Then there's the hurricanes. And eventually the diseases took over a lot of settlers' lives. You know, we had mosquitoes, which they knew what mosquitoes were, and the Indians knew how to keep the mosquitoes away, but the settlers didn't. So many of our ancestors were taken away by malaria, yellow fever, there was cholera, typhoid fever. So when you think about all that, everything they had to endure and persevere through and fight against, and then you add the wars and the disgruntled settlers that were coming in from Europe, and they wanted this property and they wanted that property. It was a very tough time, and I seriously never appreciated my family more than after I wrote this book, because I think back about my great-great-grandmother. She was from Germany, and you know, Andy knows what a beautiful place that is. And I think about her coming from the mountains of Germany and the beautiful farmlands, coming to Terracea Island. What a culture shock. To be a young woman of 20, and all of a sudden she's on this island, and then she gets married, and then she has 5 children, and a lot of the time she was there by herself, just like all the other women. Their husband, they were off hunting and fishing and fighting in the wars. So if you want to appreciate where you live a little bit more, you read this book. Read some of the old pioneer histories that are in the Eaton room. Just see what those people had to go through just to make a meager living and carve out a little piece of land. And I think the average age of dying was probably about 50 back then. And most families lost half their children due to illness. You know, just the heartbreak of that makes me so grateful that they endured that so I could live here today. Because Bradenton is a beautiful place, and it's still a friendly city. They named it that a long time ago. But I'm going to let Ron come up. He's going to talk about his part of the book. The thing is, I had the family history, and I had the mentality to write Frederica's book, her part. You know, the chapters go back and forth. If you see a hibiscus on a chapter, that's a chapter I wrote from Frederica's perspective. Having babies, you know, living with a fisherman, with other fishermen in his little rancho, all the things that she went through. And he wrote fighting in the Seminole War, fishing out in the big storms, the Civil War. And it's amazing what he has been able to research to find. Not many people knew much about Manatee County history for the military, but he's got some things to tell you about that are amazing, that he could bring so much information into writing the book. So we were a good pair. I brought the emotional woman side, and he brought all but hopefully it weaves in together. This is our first book. We're not authors, and we're not speakers. Authors usually don't make speakers, and speakers usually don't make good authors. But we're trying to do both because we want to promote, and we want everyone in Manatee County to catch a glimpse of what life was like. So thank you for having us.
It is a pleasure to be here with you today. Just a little bit about my background. I'm a Manatee County resident, lifelong. We came here when I was about 3 months old. My mother was from New England, and all of our history goes back there 400 years to Gloucester, Massachusetts. My dad's from Syracuse, New York, which is where I was born. But I was raised here in the Manatee public school system. And I can say that my interest in Manatee County history literally goes back to age 5. I can remember riding a bus from where I lived over in the Cedar Hammock area, where Peggy also grew up. And we'd ride the bus right by the old 1850 Manatee burial grounds. And I have a mental image still of looking out the side of the bus, down at the old headstones in the cemetery, And I don't know why at 5 years old I would be wondering who these people were, but I was, but I was really intrigued by that. And we'd go out to recess, and I'd immediately go back to the back fence and just stare at the cemetery again. So I don't know why some people are interested in history, some people aren't, or how in the world it could start when you're 5, but it did. And a lot of family trips. There was one trip we made up to Ocala, and again, there was an old pioneer cemetery. And for some reason, I wanted to know who these people were. And that kind of stuck with me all the way through grade school. 4th grade, we had Florida history, and I still have the notebook from back then. I wish I would have brought it today. But studying Florida history here in Manatee County in the 4th grade was pretty limited to the 16th century, obviously because of Hernando de Soto. And of course, you had the Gamble Mansion, you had Bradenton Castle, you had a few historical markers that explained that. But it seemed like the history here was just, just pockets of history, isolated from the larger context of what happened in Florida and what happened in the United States. So as time went on through college and everything, I kind of felt like if history happened, it was everywhere but Bradenton, it was everywhere but Manatee County. My grandmother used to speak often about our family roots in New England. She was real proud of our Revolutionary War drummer. She had a picture of the Spirit of 76 up on the over her piano. And all those things kind of drove my interest in history. And so I worked as an artist, graphic designer, multimedia designer for 35 years at the St. Pete Times. 5 years prior to that, I worked at Manatee Memorial Hospital with Carol Whitmore, our physicians coordinator, director, and we did the physicians newsletter together there. And it was during that time when I started exploring what was the history of Manatee County, the pioneer history. Who were these people buried in that 1850 cemetery? I was asked by Kathy Slesser, who used to be at the Historical Records Library, to join the Historical Commission. I also joined a local Civil War unit that was a very hardcore unit that would camp and eat and everything the way the soldiers did to try to learn more about the Civil War. But even at that time, I didn't realize the part that Manatee County or Tampa Bay played in the Civil War. By chance, a friend of mine happened to come across a diary of Robert Watson, a man that was from Key West, that fled Key West in 1861 during the Union occupation, and he came here to Manatee River. Several of the men in the area joined what was called the Florida Volunteer Coast Guard at that time, including Miguel Guerrero, who I'd heard before. Miguel was in newspaper articles from time to time when a local writer might be telling the story of the tragedy out at Terracea Island, what befell the family out there, which we go into detail in the book. But I didn't have any idea that Miguel or other men in the area actually served as soldiers in the Confederate Army. A lot of men moved here after the war, but I had no idea that Bradenton, Manatee then, had any part of that. So finding the diary of Robert Watson opened up the whole history of the Tampa Bay area. It was a typewritten script. The original diary is up at the Chickamauga-Chattanooga National Park in Tennessee, but nobody locally had any idea of the existence of that diary. So I spent the next few years researching that, and we published it in Tampa Bay History Magazine in 1988. The historian at the Tampa Tribune, Leland Hawes, flipped out when he read that and called me up, and he said, "Ron, nobody knows this." And so now if anybody is writing about Tampa Bay during the Civil War, they reference the Robert Watson diary and the work that I did on that. So that was really my big entrance into local history. And it's also my connection again to Miguel Guerrero, because he was a member of Company K of the 7th Florida. Years passed, I found out that Marion Anderson, Peggy's mom, was a direct descendant of Miguel Guerrero. And I'd known Marion and Peggy and her sisters all my life since we were young kids at West Bradenton Baptist Church. So I called her up and I said, "I just found out you're a descendant of Miguel Guerrero." And she said, yeah. And I said, well, I have a lot of information about him during his service in the Civil War. So I got together with her. Skipping forward a few years, Peggy moved down from Atlanta, and we kept running into each other all the time at restaurants, her family. And I found out about her interest in researching her family further. We happened to go to one of Kathy Slusser's book talks, and I made mention afterwards to Peggy that I'd always thought about trying to write a novel, and she said, why don't you write about Miguel? And of course, like she said, you know, we're not writers, I'm an artist, you know, graphic designer. So the thought of writing a historical novel was kind of an overwhelming thought at the time. And so originally she was going to help research it, and I was going to try to write it. I wrote a chapter when I was stuck on the Skyway one day going to the Tampa Bay Times. Ironically, it was on Terracea too, so it was a fitting place. So I'm sitting there and I'm writing it on my iPhone. And so I shipped it off to her, and I CC'd her mom and thinking, you know, are they going to like this or not? And they acted like they really did. So I started working on the next chapter, but a few weeks went by. Peggy says months, you know. And so then she one night surprised me with an email. And it was, she said, see, I am an author too, A-W-T-H-E-R, author. And so I opened that up, and it was one of the chapters that's in the book now about the Pioneer Christmas on Terracea. But I was blown away by that. I'm like, you're kidding. She's an author, and she didn't tell me. So I wrote back to her, and I said, tell you what, I'm thinking about the book Cold Mountain. You know, I don't know if anybody's read that, but it's an interplay between the male and female characters. Sorry about hitting that. But he was a Civil War soldier, and then his to-be wife was at home trying to keep the family together, keep the farm together. And I thought that might be a great idea for me to write Miguel's parts and for Peggy to write Frederica's parts. So that's what we did, and that's how the book came to life. Since I had already done a lot of the research on the Civil War and the Seminole War history of the county, a lot of which came from the Seminole War part, a lot of that research came from Dewey Dye's work. And then the Robert Watson diary filling in all of Miguel's time here in Tampa Bay, and the diary also follows Miguel's time all the way up into Tennessee, up to the Ohio border during the Kentucky campaign. So all of that research about Miguel, his time in the Civil War, which is also includes the other men of Tampa Bay at that time. You'll read about that in Miguel Bay. You'll also read about the Seminole War activities that occurred right here on the river at the beginning of the Third Seminole War. This is where the Third Seminole War started. Right here, the raid on the Snell House at Whitaker Bayou, the raids at the Bradenton Plantation, the raids upriver at the Goddard home and the Craig home. That's what started the Third Seminole War. And that's stuff I'd never heard about growing up. It certainly wasn't in my fourth grade workbook. These are a couple of the Seminole Indians, Billy Bowlegs on the left, and an unknown Seminole warrior on the right. Billy Bowlegs and a lot of the Seminole Indians made frequent trips here to Manatee Village because there was a trading post there. The Lee Trading Post and the Clark Trading Post. And they would come off the reservation. The reservation was located 20 miles offshore, all the way around the southern peninsula of Florida, to keep them away from the trading post. That was part of the government's plan, headed by Jefferson Davis, to encourage the Seminoles to migrate out to Oklahoma. They thought if they could cut them off from the trading post, that would kind of encourage them, like, life isn't good here, you know, it's time to go. They had large real estate interests in draining the Everglades as early as 1850, and so that's why they wanted them gone. But Billy Bowlegs became friends with a lot of the settlers here in Manatee Village at the time, would eat dinner at their homes and things. So a lot of the history of the Seminole Indian War period is also reflected in the book. All the people that you read about in the book are actual settlers, like the Glaziers, the Gates, names that you know. And then it follows Miguel and the activities through the Civil War. Do you have that map, Matt? that was Asa Bishop, and who plays an integral part of the story, actually saves Miguel towards the end. I won't tell you any more about that. This is the earliest map of the Manatee County area, dated 1845. It was an Army map, and if we leave it up there maybe afterwards, people can take a closer look. But all the rivers are Indian names, Muskogee Creek Indian names. And the name of the Manatee River at that time was Bear Hammock River. So there must have been a lot of bears upriver at one point. So this was the time period when Miguel arrived from Minorca, about 1845. We know he established his rancho in 1848, but we think he first went to New Orleans, and then at the tail end of the Second Seminole Indian War in 1842, he was running on steamers because he was a qualified navigator on commercial ships in Minorca. So we think that that's how he discovered the Tampa Bay area, and then by 1848, he was working the ranchos, living on Terracea Island at the Madeira Bickle Mound area, Boots Point. He owned that whole shoreline, if anybody's familiar with Terracea, from Boots Point all the way to the Madeira Bickle Mound area. 1855, he met Frederica Kramer, who was an immigrant from Bavaria. They didn't have any language in common, so it was all nonverbal. So they married against the advices of her aunt, who, fishermen at that time were really bottom of the rung, and she probably had higher interests and aspirations for her niece than that. But so we think it probably had to be true love. I don't know if you remember seeing the grass huts or the palm thatch huts at the beginning, but we had a middle-class woman coming from Bavaria move into this kind of a situation on Terracea Island with all the, mosquitoes and you name it, living like Seminole Indians. So she had to have been in love with this man. Right after they got married, the Seminole Indian War started, the Third Seminole Indian War, and Miguel was he volunteered. A lot of the fishermen at that time didn't. But we know that Miguel wanted to be a citizen. He actually started signing his name on Seminole Indian rolls as Michael Guerrero. And he served as a juror here in Manatee County. We found him on the juror rolls when we were doing our research. So he joined Addison's Florida Mounted Militia, which was stationed up at Rye Bridge, Upper Manatee River. And he was part of the party that chased down the Indians that attacked the Bradenton Castle or Bradenton Plantation up to Little Manatee River. After that, of course, he thought he was going to get a break. And what's ironic, the name Guerrero, if anybody knows Spanish, means warrior. And he left Minorca because Minorca was in the middle of the Spanish Civil War in 1845. And one of the reasons he left there was because of the devastation war had played on Spain, and came here to Florida for peace and quiet, get some land, own property. And he runs right into two wars. When the Civil War started in 1861, Tampa Bay was blockaded by the Union Navy, and they tried to run blockades to bring in the basic essentials that they needed. And the first year of the war, Miguel was part of that, trying to run salt around in his boat. Talks about that in the book. And then it follows him when the Florida Volunteer Coast Guard becomes Company K of the 7th Florida. And the book will follow his travels up through Florida, Georgia, up to Knoxville, Tennessee, and into the Kentucky campaign. And we use the Robert Watson diary for that. So when you're reading the book, every town, every creek, every mountain pass that you go through is all documented by that diary. And one of the reasons we did that was for Peggy's family. So, which was the original intent of the book, really, was just for her family members. So they could take that book, and if they wanted to trace their great-great-grandfather, through the Civil War, they could actually plot that, and follow his activities. So that's Miguel's Bay. There's a lot more to it than that, but it'll really give you good insights into life here in Manatee County from 1845 to 1870, and we hope you'll read it. we'd like to open to any questions. Peggy, you want to come up and questions with me? Hard to see with the lights.
I wanted to mention too that we did some research in Menorca. We were able to take my older son on a trip right before the book was going to be published and found 3 more generations of Miguel's family. We went to the church where he was born and baptized in. It was a beautiful little Spanish mission type. Well, it looks more like a cathedral, like a small cathedral. His family was buried there. So that was the icing on the cake, too, was to go and find his backstory before he even got to Manatee County. We had some amazing experiences over there, ran into people that we never should have run into that gave us help and information we never thought we could find. And someday when we have more time, we'll talk about some of those experiences, too.
They were here, and there. I think I called
Lady
on
in the
him
back.
first.
Ladies first.
You mentioned one of the things was a Fogarty. I'm curious if that Fogarty was part of that line?
The Fogartyville in Bradenton, which was between 26th Street and Miss Lewis Bayou, there's a marker there. That Fogarty family is related to me, and you'll figure out how when you read the book.
Historic Village, Friends of Manatee Village, I want to talk to you guys.
Okay, yeah.
Is there much documentation in that in terms of here and the slaves, the blacks that were involved in the Civil War and the Seminoles? Did all of them ship to Oklahoma?
Are you talking about the black Seminoles?
The black Seminoles, the black slaves?
Yeah. The black Seminoles were a large part. Well, we don't really go into that a whole lot because that's going to be in our next book. We're writing a book now about the Seminole Indian War, and a couple of Seminoles in particular that lived here in Braden River on Manatee River. But we're going to go into a lot more detail about the black Seminoles. The blacks didn't consider them slaves. Sometimes you hear that they were slaves of the Seminole, but they were looked at as living side by side with them, whereas under whites, blacks didn't own property. Under the Seminoles, the blacks owned their own land, they owned their own crops. They gave a tribute to the Seminoles that they were with, but they were able to own their own things. And they also intermarried, which was a lot different. And as far as the Manatee County during the Civil War part, we've mentioned Gamble Plantation, but we don't really get into a lot of depth into that because the focus is primarily on Miguel Guerrero and his family, and he didn't own any slaves. So, we didn't get into in depth with that.
A lot of people don't realize the Seminole Indians were not an indigenous set of Indians. They were a combination of the Creek Indians that were escaping from Georgia and Alabama when Andrew Jackson was pushing them down to make property available for the white people. They had runaway slaves mixed with them. They had the Spanish fishermen. So, years before really Florida was a state, Florida had a big group of people living here and really working together well. The Indians, the slaves, the runaways, the Spanish fishermen coming over from Spain, and different, even European immigrants were coming way back then too. Basically, they just squatted on property, and then hopefully later they became the owners of it. And everybody got along just well before Andrew Jackson decided that the Indians needed to be killed. Really, that was his main purpose, just get rid of them so that we can bring in all these new people and create a state, which was terrible for the Indians.
That's messed up.
It is messed up.
Yes, sir. Can you talk about where the best snook holes are?
Yeah.
We're not allowed to give that information out. I can tell you what, when we're at the market selling the book, commercial fishermen come up all the time,
Yeah.
and they say, "We loved your book. Quit telling people where Miguel Bay is," because that's their honey hole. Like I said, it's got more fish and more species of birds than any other little estuary around.
We mention a couple in the book.
Yeah, we do.
Oh, that's funny. Did I hear something like the ranches were burned ultimately and destroyed in one kind of event, or am I?
When the ranchos were burned, Yeah, back in 1838, the Second Seminole War started in 1835. And the military officers at Fort Brooke in Tampa started worrying about the Seminole Indians getting ammunition and arms from Cuba. And so and they probably had good reason to believe that too, but they believed that the ranchos were a conduit, between the Seminole Indians and Havana. And they accused Theodore Bunce, who was a rancho owner at Shaw's Point, of being involved in that, whether somebody ratted him out, if he actually did or not. But in 1838, they sent a military expedition down to Shaw's Point, DeSoto National Memorial, for you that don't know that. And they burned the rancho, and they took off all the wives and children while the fishermen were off fishing. So one of the characters, our next book will cover that too. It'll cover that period of time. But, that was a real heartbreak for them. Earlier than that, the fishermen had signed a petition to the state of Florida that they would be recognized and they would be protected. But the military looked at that as too much of a threat, so they had to go, and the ranchos were shut down. But there were continued to be individual Spanish fishermen after that, like Miguel.
Mm-hmm. The Spanish fishermen of that time even signed a petition to give to the governor of Florida that if they had been married and they had 2 generations of Seminole relatives in their family, that the governor would let those women and children stay. And they still took them away when they were gone. They just came home and all the wives and children were gone. And, most of you know that the Indians were taken to Egmont Key to be stockaded before they were taken to Oklahoma. People hear about the Trail of Tears over land, but we call it the Voyage of Tears. We took all the southern Florida Indians by boat from Egmont Key to St. Mark's and then up the Mississippi and the Arkansas River, and pretty much just dumped them in Oklahoma and said, good luck. They weren't.
Said that's all the time we got.
Okay, sorry. We have to stop talking.
Turn it over to you. Very good.
Thanks for not ringing that big bell.
And we do have books available if you want any.
Peggy, come up here. All right, as with tradition with Kiwanis, we want to thank you very much for speaking with us today and present you with the very coveted golden ruler of Kiwanis. And you get a picture with Lemoyne.
Okay. Wasn't sure if we were going to get spanked with that or something.
Oh, no. Right. Thank you so much for coming.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for having us.
And you guys will be around afterwards if you have time.
We'll be over here.
And so books are available for purchase here and also for further questions of both Peggy and Ron. Thank you very much for coming today. Really appreciate all of your time. We've got a great meeting next week. Have a great weekend.
Thank you.